After Trump's bombing of Venezuela to force regime change and take over the oil industry, the dominoes could be falling and other countries on his hit list are feeling vulnerable. The most vulnerable of all is Cuba, and the New York Times is reporting shockwaves over what Trump and his Cuban-American enabler Marco Rubio are up to. And I have it all for you next. I'm Dan and welcome to another Occupy Democrats video. To get all of our reports on Trump's war on everything, please hit that subscribe button. Let's begin with Trump and Rubio's own ominous words on a potential Cuban strike and takeover, and it includes an odd giddy cameo from Trump toady Lindsey Graham.
Is the Cuban government the Trump administration's next target, Mr. Secretary?
Well, the Cuban government is a huge problem. Yeah, the Cuban government is a huge problem. First of all,
is that a yes?
Cuba, but I don't think people fully appreciate. I think they're in a lot of trouble, yes. I'm not going to talk to you about what our future steps are going to be and our policies are going to be right now in this regard, but I don't think it's any mystery that we are not big fans of the Cuban regime, who, by the way, are the ones that were propping up Maduro. His entire, internal security force, his internal security apparatus is entirely controlled by Cubans. One of the untold stories here is how, in essence, you talk about colonization, because I think you said Delcy Rodriguez mentioned that. The ones who have sort of colonized, at least inside the regime, are Cubans. It was Cubans that guarded Maduro. He was not guarded by Venezuelan bodyguards. He had Cuban bodyguards. In terms of their internal intelligence, who spies on who inside to make sure there are no traitors, those are all Cubans.
That Cuba is ready to fall. You know? Yes. Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they're going to hold out. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. And Cuba literally is ready to fall. And you have a lot of great Cuban Americans that are going to be very happy about this.
So, Mr. Secretary and Mr. President, please bottom line this for us. Is Cuba at risk for a U.S. takeover?
Yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
The answer is yes.
And now for a sampling of the cavalcade of Cuba reactions. Anna Kasparian called out Rubio on CNN.
I think what's ridiculous is that we're all pretending like this is about a drug war, when in reality it's about a regime change war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has a bone to pick. What they say out loud that we're supposed to pretend like we're not supposed to listen to. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has a bone to pick with Venezuela because he feels that they are providing material support to Cuba, and he wants regime change in Cuba because he himself is a Cuban American and doesn't like that the communist revolution happened.
I'd like to see regime change in Cuba,
but that's not our business, okay? We have people suffering here in the United States. I'm not interested in a regime change war
they are coming into the U.S.
I'm interested in taking care of our country.
And Representative Ro Khanna called out Trump and added a call to action for his colleagues. As a response to the illegal strikes in Venezuela, Congress must force votes and debate every day this month on war power resolutions to prevent Trump from invading Cuba, Colombia, Greenland, Nigeria, Panama, Iran. It is time for Congress to wake up and do our job. And now for the shockwave, as reported by the Washington Post. Team Trump puts a target on Cuba with threats and oil blockade. No place was hit harder than Cuba by the shockwaves that Saturday morning's U.S. military seizure of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro sent throughout Latin America and the world. No place was hit harder than Cuba by the shockwaves that Saturday morning's U.S. military seizure of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro sent throughout Latin America and the world. Within hours of the operation, long before the government in Havana acknowledged it, phone calls and texts across the island spread the news that dozens of elite Cuban security forces had been killed guarding Maduro. But by the time it finally released a statement late Sunday saying that 32 of its military and security personnel were dead in Caracas, the Cuban government had bigger problems on its hands. Both President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio made clear over the weekend that the collapse of Cuba's communist government was not only a likely side benefit of Maduro's ouster, but a goal. If you're asking if the Cuban government will just collapse on its own because the economic pain is bound to increase without shipments of Venezuelan oil, I'm very skeptical, said Michael J. Bustamante, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Cuban Studies Program at the University of Miami. Juan Gonzalez, who served as Western Hemisphere Director on the Biden administration's national security staff, said that cutting off the oil deliveries is going to put a huge squeeze on the humanitarian situation in Cuba, which is already suffering regular electricity blackouts and food scarcities. But I don't think the regime is going to cry uncle. People who aspire to be opposition leaders are either in Miami or in Madrid or in jail. said William Leo Grande, a specialist in Latin American affairs at American University. A Venezuela-like removal of even a handful of individuals is unlikely to rattle the multi-layered entrenched party and military power centers to the point of collapse, he said. As for Cubans themselves, Alzugare said, I wouldn't think that people are so desperate that they will welcome an American intervention or a group of Miami Cubans taking over. What people want is the Cuban government to change, he said, but in Cuban terms not imposed by the outside. Those are just the highlights of the Karen DeYoung and David Oval article. For the full story, visit the Washington Post website.
I'll wrap up with a post by activist Isabel Scarlett, who one-upped Ro Khanna by zooming out on Trump's out-of-control and lawless rhetoric. Rhetoric that is empowered by the sycophants around him like Rubio. She said,
during Trump's second term, he has militarily threatened Mexico, Canada, Cuba, Colombia, Kala Alit Nunat, Panama, bombed Iran, Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Venezuela, threatened to depose leader of Cuba, Colombia, kidnapped the leader of Venezuela.
It can be argued that some regime changes are necessary, and there's clips of Venezuelans and Cubans celebrating, but I believe in duality and pointing out the deception. While Trump and Rubio speak of the failures of those countries, this move is obviously fuel for Trump's power-mongering soul, and he will exploit them for their strategic and economic value.